Now, we always complain when huge UFC fights get cancelled, but sometimes a fight getting cancelled might have been the best thing that could have happened. Today we're going to be breaking down booked UFC fights that never actually happened, and why in hindsight those fights being cancelled might have been the best thing that ever happened. So let's get into it. So starting off the list, not in any particular order, is going to be Khamzat Chimaev versus Nate Diaz. Now, this fight was fully booked and the weigh-ins were happening, but the fight was cancelled due to Khamzat not making weight, and it was actually a massive mismatch. I don't know who was behind the idea of putting Khamzat Chimaev and Nate Diaz against each other. You've got a young, hungry guy who's got one of the most dominant styles of wrestling and is absolutely mauling people. And you had Nate Diaz, who had decent jiu-jitsu, but was at the end of his career. At the time, he was 37 years old. He was known for being one of the most durable fighters in the UFC and was well liked by many fans across the world. When you heard Nate Diaz's name, you knew that you were going to be in for a good, interesting fight, because Nate Diaz was well liked by many people for his stunts in the octagon and for his performances and for how durable he was. However, the UFC saw this as a chance to build Khamzat Chimaev's name off the back of Nate Diaz by beating Nate Diaz, a well-liked fan favourite who has a big name for himself. And if Khamzat was able to beat him quite easily and dominantly, it would pull Khamzat Chimaev into the eyes of casual fans and get more attention to him and build his name up off the back of Nate Diaz, which was quite scummy when you think about it, because you have a veteran of the sport, which was Nate Diaz, and instead of giving him a decent, well-matched fight, they decided to give him Khamzat Chimaev at the end of his career, because they knew that he didn't stand a chance against Khamzat Chimaev because he was such a absolute unstoppable machine. And by beating Nate Diaz, it allowed Khamzat Chimaev to get the eyes of normal watchers, casual watchers of the sport, people who know Nate Diaz as one of the biggest UFC fighters. By beating him, it propels him into stardom and gets more eyes on him and watching his career. So the fact that this fight got cancelled because of Khamzat missing weight, it was a big blessing for Nate Diaz, because it's one, stopped him from getting mauled and submitted and losing in a way that was pretty dominant, and it allowed him to get a replacement fight with Tony Ferguson and have a better ending for his career. Go out and a win and on his terms, rather than just being sacrificed to Khamzat Chimaev so that the UFC could build a new star off of his back. Now, the next fight that we have on the list is going to be Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Tony Ferguson, and this fight actually, in hindsight, saved Tony Ferguson, because at the time Khabib was a very dominant wrestler. That style he had of mauling people, no one could really figure him out. And at the time, Tony Ferguson was seen as the boogeyman of that division. If people had to put someone to beat Khabib at the time, it was Tony Ferguson. But because of the fight getting cancelled because of COVID restrictions and Khabib not being able to fight because of that, Khabib had to pull out and Tony was put against Justin Gaethje for an interim belt. That fight was really the beginning of the end for Tony Ferguson. He got pretty badly beaten up by Justin Gaethje in that fight, and then went on a losing streak, getting beaten by Michael Chandler, Charles Oliveira, getting dominated by Paddy Pimblett, and just losing many times in the UFC since that fight. Really showed us that Tony was never really going to be on Khabib's level. Tony was deteriorating, and having to face someone like Khabib Nurmagomedov, he was undefeated and no one could figure him out, and has that very dominant style. I hate to say it, but we would have seen Tony Ferguson getting mauled on the ground and possibly, maybe submitted. I don't see it happening, but there is a slight chance. But Tony would have got his soul crushed in that fight against Khabib. Now, the next fight on the list is going to be Conor McGregor versus RDA, and this fight thankfully never happened, because for RDA, yes, he had decent stand-up and great wrestling and jiu-jitsu, but when compared to Conor McGregor, at the time, at McGregor's peak, McGregor's striking was probably the best in the lightweight and featherweight divisions, and McGregor's takedown defense wasn't pretty bad. But I know some of you would say, hey, he lost to Nate Diaz via submission and he got dominated by Khabib. Now with Khabib it's different, because he's probably one of the best wrestlers of all time in the UFC, and getting submitted by Nate Diaz was primarily due to the fact that he got gassed and made a stupid decision to just try to knock out one of the most durable fighters, which made absolutely zero sense. Combined with the fact that McGregor at the time, he was on top of the world, his striking and timing was completely better than RDA, and when you look at how RDA lost to Eddie Alvarez and compare it to the way McGregor beat Alvarez, you can see the fact that McGregor's ability to stop takedowns and having great takedown defense and having the best timing and power behind his shots would have starched RDA, and McGregor would have beaten him. So I'm glad it never happened for RDA, because it would have been, quite devastating for him to lose in that style of fashion, and after getting constantly trash talked by Conor McGregor in the press conferences, it would have probably been, a lot to deal with, and I'm glad it never turned out that way for RDA. Now moving on, we've got Dustin Poirier versus Nate Diaz, and this fight thankfully never happened, and it saved Nate Diaz, mainly due to the fact that Dustin Poirier at the time was in his prime. You had Dustin Poirier being one of the best boxers in the UFC, having great power behind his shots and just having excellent boxing and being able to damage people because of how intelligent he was. So for Nate Diaz, not being able to fight him really did help him in the long run when you think about it, because yes, we know that Nate Diaz is someone that is very tough, he's very durable and can take a lot of punishment. In the long run, I don't think that would have helped Nate Diaz in his career. It probably would have damaged him and worn him out a lot sooner, but also it had the potential to damage the persona and the reputation that Nate Diaz had. Now what I mean by this is that everyone knows that Nate Diaz is tough, and he's the guy that took out Conor McGregor and submitted him and put on a decent fight, where a lot of people thought that it could have went either way in the rematch. So to fight Dustin Poirier and potentially lose in a dominant way, getting outstruck, and we know that Nate Diaz isn't someone who is willing to quit, so to be completely outclassed and potentially KO'd would have harmed Nate Diaz's reputation and popularity in the UFC. Now the final fight on the list is going to be Max Holloway versus Khabib Nurmagomedov, and I say this because it would have been pretty one-sided for Khabib Nurmagomedov and pretty devastating for Max Holloway. When you look at the facts, he was going into the lightweight division as a featherweight fighter. Yes, he is one of the greatest featherweights of all time with great striking, but to fight in the lightweight division against a specialist who was Khabib Nurmagomedov, who was just excellent at wrestling and groundwork and submitting people, having to fight him in the lightweight division for your very first fight in lightweight for a title and having a very bad weight cut would have, really harmed Max Holloway. And thankfully the fight was cancelled because of how bad the weight cut was, but if it was to happen, I would have seen Max Holloway getting completely dominated due to the fact we haven't seen Max Holloway deal with wrestlers like that before, and having to fight that specialist and one of the greatest wrestlers of all time in the lightweight division for your first fight against that style would have been very one-sided for Khabib, and I would have seen that Max Holloway would have lost. But anyways, these were just my opinions of the fights that were cancelled but were low-key blessings for certain fighters. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Make sure you like, subscribe, turn on that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.